It's the same Genesis story about Adam and Eve, you know, the tree of life, the knowledge of God.
Must feel like your God abandoned you.
The notion that our gods really came not from the heavens, but from the stars.
The origin of Prometheus seems to start around 2002, when Ridley Scott said he was seriously mulling over the idea of an Alien 5. There were a number of concepts to work with for an Alien follow-up. One Scott mentioned as under consideration was a film set on Earth, possibly resembling the scrapped ideas for the finale of the last Alien film, Resurrection. But Scott said that where his true interests lied was with a prequel concept, a kind of alien origin story. This wasn't Scott's first flirtation with the idea. Back in the late 1980s, the same concept had been floated for Alien 3, but Scott decided not to pursue the project at the time, and following dozens of script submissions and rewrites, Alien 3 became something completely different. Now it was back on the table again. Scott continued thinking along this line and talked about it further on a DVD commentary for Aliens Director's Cut in 2003, exploring what could happen with the first xenomorph eggs and the strange creatures that first brought them to the planet LV-426 in the first film. It's a tough one, particularly with the success of 4. I think if you close the lid, it should be the end of the first chapter, and I think very simply what no one's done is simply gone back to revisit what was it. No one's ever said, who's the space jockey? He wasn't an alien. What was that battleship? Is it a battleship? Is it an aircraft carrier? Is it a biomechanoid weapon carrier? Why did it land? Did it crash land, or did it settle there because it had engine trouble? And how long ago? Because those eggs would sit there. The Alien follow-up ideas seemed to gain some traction as Scott worked together with Aliens director James Cameron to drum up what the sequel could look like. But the plans were quickly derailed when Fox pivoted towards their spin-off franchise idea, Alien vs. Predator.
What did you say this room was called?
Sacrificial chamber.
Which Cameron described as killing the validity of the franchise in his mind, although he did change his mind when he saw the finished product for Alien vs. Predator. But he still felt alienated from the franchise, seeing it as Fox's property, something he was unwilling to work with due to a wariness of studio meddling. Scott decided to stick with the project, however, and Fox ended up supporting him, laying the groundwork in secret by paying for a research team to help Scott in envisioning his hypothetical sci-fi future. The project was initially announced as an Alien reboot in 2009, before Fox quickly backtracked and branded it a prequel. Originally, Scott wasn't planning to take as much of a leading role in the project as he had with the original Alien film, opting for Carl Rinch, a director known previously for advertising and a family friend of Scott's, to work on the project as his first feature film. But Fox ended up insisting that Scott return to direct, otherwise they would pull their support. Scott then ultimately agreed to take up the helm once again. Once that hurdle was overcome in June 2009, focus shifted to writing in July, with writer John Spates being brought on to flesh out Scott's prequel concept after Scott was impressed with his initial suggestions of what the film could look like in a meeting. Following these initial positive reactions, Spates drafted a 20-page outline for the film, then put together a screenplay that he delivered to Scott on Christmas Day 2009.
Spates did a lot of the foot slog on a lot of the stuff around the table with me going, yeah, but what about this and what about that?
This was followed by a flurry of activity with Spates working together with Scott's team to sketch and conceptualize the scenes as he came up with them.
I would literally come in and write some new pages, come in and talk to people about them. Ridley would go home and I'd go down to the art room and I'd hang out with Arthur and his artists. And we'd sip a glass of wine and talk about the monsters and what they ought to be like and how we think the scene really looks. And I would go home and come back in at 9:30 the next morning, and there would be paintings this wide on the wall of the scene I wrote the day before.
This culminated in the start of pre-production in April 2010 and the script's completion by June, with Scott announcing that the setting would be 30 years before the events of the original Alien, leaving room for more entries of the prequel storyline if there was a desire for it, with at least a second prequel being suggested as something that could be squeezed in. The film was to tackle themes of a kind of creation myth, with Scott likening the exploration of the space jockey to his own personal musings about the origin of humanity.
The farther we push into the development of the story, the bigger the engineers got. and the more marginalized the original alien monster became, until that monster became a kind of feature or grace note in a larger story that was about humanity meeting its makers, humanity confronting the forces that had created it and maybe not liking them that much.
His curiosity over the improbability of our development as a species and the potential for extraterrestrial life. However, despite the bold ideas behind the project, production ended up being derailed again, with Scott feeling that this alien movie had too much alien in it. So he reached out to writer Damon Lindelof for consultation, who argued that a direct prequel would be less interesting of a plot as the audience already knew where it led, pushing for something less tied to the tropes of the IP.
All the things that I loved about John's work was that he seemed very interested in this idea of the engineers.
I think, frankly, that he was brought aboard because at the time that I was working on that script, I'd never had a movie produced, and in the view of a studio head, untested.
Scott agreed and worked with Lindelof to redevelop Spate's screenplay in this direction, with Lindelof explaining, "When I say alien to you, you think facehugger, chestburster, eggs, acid, blood. Queen, the concentration of those things was much higher in John's script than they were in Prometheus."
It really happened when we were in the very home stretch. Like, we think we're ready to go. And the studio had two thoughts. They were like, let's dial back the alien monsters and lean more on the engineers, and let's get a known writer on this and bring it home. Which of course I didn't love, but which as an unproduced writer at that time, I had been told to expect from the very beginning.
Lindelof also worked to make the characters stand out on their own, rather than just stand-ins for the same roster of original franchise characters. Scott would say that by the end of the third act, you start to realize there's a DNA of the very first Alien, but none of the subsequent films. The film's lead, Shaw, was differentiated from Ripley as the Nostromo crew by making her much more culpable in the film's events and emphasizing her scientific background.
It's appalling med pod. They only made a dozen of these.
With the story being a cautionary tale of science gone wrong, as opposed to the original Alien, where the protagonists were, for the most part, doing things by the book. The supporting character, android David 8, was made to be much more openly robotic. As Lindelof put it, having no interest in being a real boy, a sharp contrast from Alien's Bishop, who tries to humanize himself among the crew, and Ash, who did the same until the second half of the film, at least.
You say, here's a bunch of humans that are seeking out a race of beings who may or may not have created life on Earth, and they're bringing with them a synthetic human that they've created. You now have a couple of different generations, and so you have this character, David, on the ship with them, who basically has a perspective of, hey, I hang out with my creators all the time, and you might be disappointed.
Lindelof's new version was submitted in summer 2010, but Fox decided to be picky, causing yet more turmoil for the production. This time it was haggling over the budget and the rating, with Fox reportedly pushing for the film to be tame enough for a PG rating, while Scott wanted the film to stay as an R rating. This time it was Fox that buckled, and development once again continued, initially under the name of Paradise, but renamed in January 2011 to the title we know now, Prometheus. With the production set to begin in March of that year, aiming for a 2012 release, initially aiming for March 9th, but then being pushed back to June 8th. Principal filming would begin on March 21st, 2011, and would last for about 82 days. After Alien Resurrection 4 was filmed in the US, Prometheus would bring the franchise back home to Shepperton and Pinewood Studios in England.
We ended up in Pinewood, which is, that said, I've never worked on this since I did Legend. So we had the Bond stage, which of course is 40% longer than H stage at Shepperton. So I fundamentally booked the Bond stage for 10 months. And 5 other stages.
The 007 stage is one of the largest in the world and has a long history of directors abusing it with multiple fires and explosions damaging it. Funny enough, Ridley Scott had been around for one of those fires in 1984 at the tail end of his film, Legend, where the 007 stage was burnt to the ground.
The set burned down was, I would think, about 3 weeks before coming to the end of using the Bond stage. We'd been using a lot of gas in there for the fire. We just finished the fairy dance. Well, I think what happened is the fumes gradually built in the roof, which was 70 feet up, but it's filled with a polystyrene structure which looks like a forest. I'm in the editing room and I hear this pitter-patter down the corridor. It said, the Bond stage is on fire. So I walked out down the corridor, and as I got to the end, I could see over the buildings this giant column of smoke like a battleship was sinking. And all my gas bottles were exploding inside the studio, so they had steel corrugated walls. So every time a bottle went, the walls ballooned. It's kind of beautiful.
I'm sure everyone involved was hoping for no fires or explosions this time around. Including booking these sound stages, they would also book some backlots to use for their massive outside sets.
Enough of a backlot to do some pretty marvelous stuff from the belly of the Prometheus. You've got this garage which lowers itself down. It's like almost hangar size, out of which the ATVs come and the buses, which take our people onto the planet. And everything else was a green screen.
And the sets were amazing. As a production crew member said, Ridley built the greatest alien playground in the world.
We were greenlit basically at the end of October, and we were shooting at the end of third week of March with nothing built. We had designed a lot, so that was great, but we had built nothing. Because we only had that 5 months, it was a madcap process where every set would be done, struck, and we'd start the next one and have that ready 5 or 6 days prior and on to the next. So for a massive epic movie like this, it was done with a degree of factory precision that was remarkable.
It is hard to overstate the impact of walking on those sets, said producer Michael Ellenberg. It was inspiring on so many levels. There are so many understated, instinctual things that happen when you are filming on real sets. Everyone behaves in a more natural, organic fashion because it feels like a piece of reality. And these sets were truly amazing, not only from how fast they were able to construct them, but also just the sheer size of what they were trying to pull off.
I designed the Bond stage with Arthur as a massive complex. From the minute you walk into what I'd describe as the hives, they're kind of domes. And because I was always going for scale, everything was big. So the Bond stage was chock to chock, it was jammed.
Now, beyond the studio sets, they would actually get to film on location for this film, picking a place where every sci-fi film seems to look for an alien planet vibe: Iceland. Originally, they had chosen a location in Morocco for the beginning of time scene, but the Arab Spring protests in 2010 changed their plans, and they considered the Mojave Desert before landing on Iceland. An unexpected difficulty in creating Prometheus is that everything sprung out of the design of a single room and a single space jockey. The beginning of production was pretty much an open book. The crew didn't yet know what the world was supposed to look like, what it was supposed to entail, and in fact, a lot of the environments that we see in the final film took a while to be conceptualized. While the film was nicknamed Alien Prequel, it became clear over time that the focus of the film shouldn't lie in the alien monsters, but rather in the role of the engineers, which inadvertently shifted the focus away from depicting xenomorphs and put that emphasis on world building and the crafting of a sci-fi creation myth instead.
Once the story got about 4 drafts in, we started staffing up, and Arthur Max came aboard as our production designer and artists under him, and really began to push the design of the film.
During the conceptualization stage, the script got fleshed out even further. Based on Scott's visually centric storyboards, dialogue would be written based on the environments the characters found themselves in, and how those environments would influence what they would say.
The idea of taking Alien, which is just essentially this very cool in space, no one can hear you scream, it's terrifying, but on a thematic level, it's kind of just is what it is. To take that and suddenly say, now let's start to play with all these incredibly heady ideas, just about philosophically speaking, about God and the universe.
Right there, God does not build in straight lines.
Must feel like your God abandoned you.
What?
To lose Dr. Holloway after your father died under such similar circumstances.
I have to be honest with you, suddenly bringing that into the mix, which was very much there already in John's draft, I felt like, okay, let's make this thing about creation. And that opened a tremendous amount of doors. And certainly that was the movie that I think Ridley wanted to make all along.
The importance of concept art cannot be overstated, especially when it comes to the role of the think tank that the team set up. The think tank was a room which started off with blank walls and would get cluttered with designs and concepts until no free space was left. It was a room where everyone could chip in ideas. This room was set up adjacent to Ridley Scott's office so he could come by and participate in the group think sessions.
A think tank room that we were all set up in a building adjacent to Ridley's offices so that he can come and participate. Everybody had their voice heard in that room. The walls were lined with artwork. We started off with empty walls, and slowly we ran out of space several times. The discussions were roundtable discussions. Everybody had an opinion.
Scott enjoyed the design process and was open to digital 3D concepts. Designers would create environments in 3D software that would further aid the team's visually informed world building.
There was an open forum for discussion. That was, I think, very healthy and fertile.
I would go in there on a regular basis for a period of almost 4 months, actually, designing the absoluteness of the landscapes, the interior of the ships, the rooms, the suits, the creatures that we might see. Everything was designed here with 4 or 5 people.
You don't breathe, remember? So, why wear a suit?
I was designed like this because you people are more comfortable interacting with your own kind.
Ridley would come by with, you knew Ridley was coming because a tray of red wine would show up. And with enough glasses for everyone. And I guess Ridley's to come by.
A concern that was plaguing the team was repetition. Just how can this world, which is undoubtedly based on the previous movies, retain that alien feel without devolving into becoming a cliched mess? Many monster designs already have been explored in the previous movies. The xenomorphs alone have had its fair share of iterations throughout the series, and Alien vs. Predator movies, which, while not great, were still significant to keep in mind.
The design was one of the things I really enjoyed doing. And so between Arthur Max and finding his team, he got in these designers who are kind of cyber world designers. They design stuff on these marvelous laptops. Arthur chose, literally handpicked, I think, honestly, 5 of the best in the business. And then, so you're suddenly getting absolute points of reference, saying, do me a sketch of this. I don't like that because I've done that before. So how do you get off on something that looks slightly different? It's really hard.
Another source of many ruminations was the mismatched design language between Prometheus and the original Alien film. For the original Alien, everything was a little bit more rugged, a little bit more rough around the edges, while for Prometheus, the design language of the environment was much more streamlined and sleek.
So we have to hold on to the purity of the original, but at the same time try and bring in new elements, things that are not necessarily backward from where we were, but are of a similar DNA.
There was still a lasting appreciation for the work of H.R. Giger, and his work for the previous Alien films was often referenced in the production for Prometheus. A point was made to not move too far away from his art, creating new original designs with Giger's paintings as a strong reference point.
I got lucky in a way because I came across a guy called H.R. Giger 30 years ago. And Giger had this one picture which I always thought was, that's it. That is it. He'd already done it. It was in a book.
The first Alien was an inspiration for informing the alien architecture and monsters. It also directly informed the design of the new spaceship that the film was going to be taking part in. And while the Prometheus was supposed to be a bigger vessel, there still needed to be a sense of intimacy in its design.
Now, the Nostromo, as we saw when we saw the film screen, I began to appreciate the claustrophobia and how jammed up the spaces were. At the same time, he wanted a sense of scale on this version. So we had to be large, but very intimate.
The final design for the ship turned out to be a visually stunning and high-tech set. It had a big windshield which wrapped around the cockpit and on the set. The ship was surrounded by massive green screens. The entire build was connected to hydraulics, which would vibrate the ship when the landing sequence or any kind of turbulence needed to be simulated.
That all had to be put on engineering bellows, which are big rubber gasketed vibration pads, so that we could do turbulent vibration as we came into the atmosphere and rock the whole ship. And then that implied various elements of design, i.e. is the roof attached to the walls, are the corridors attached to the main space? And we decided not to do that, to detach everything.
A significant risk was a possibility that the set would crumble when the hydraulics were turned on. Due to the way it was built, many of the components did not actually attach to each other, so while some parts oscillated on their own, others didn't, and there was this fear that these bits could smash into each other or dislocate themselves from their rigs.
So everything was a bit free to jostle and jangle, but we didn't know how that would really behave. I thought it might start oscillating beyond control and smash itself to bits.
Luckily, that did not happen. What is staggering about Prometheus's production, though, is just how many components of the film were achieved practically. And another vehicular aspect needed for the film would be the various vehicles that are seen throughout the film. The rovers and ATVs were built to be fully functional and to make sense with the settings, considering that they would need to navigate all sorts of terrain.
There was going to be any battle scenes, but the thinking was that these scientists and explorers of unknown planets would be prepared to encounter anything.
Some of those vehicles needed to be able to go 50 miles per hour while carrying about a dozen people at the same time. Over time, they settled on using the chassis of a Tatra 8x8 military vehicle, which would be first stripped and then rebuilt into futuristic exploratory vehicles that are ready for anything.
They were tracked ATVs, they were difficult vehicles, we had to jump it off the ramp, and then it would, one moment they would grip one side and not the other, and it was, so he did a little bit, but not a huge amount.
Everything inside of these prop vehicles was custom built, from the seating to the flooring to the ceilings and even to the LED lights. All of these were custom solutions, which were in part optimized to look great on camera. Surprisingly, the practical emphasis of the set designs and general conceptualization of the scenarios happening on screen was in part decided on as an economic measure.
I think it worked out economically better than actually saying, well, let's have this green screen, we can do everything digitally. Digitally is not cheaper.
This is an interesting decision, as Prometheus is rife with visual effects shots, especially when compared to the original Alien movie, which due to the time it was made in didn't really have the same means to use digital effects. Prometheus from the very beginning was supposed to be a fusion of the original Alien together with an all-new storyline with its own visual, thematic, and story elements, which also informed the effects work done for this film.
The visual effects work just seemed to be spread everywhere. I mean, there were a lot of things that were ambiguous as to how much Arthur could build, how much Ridley could shoot practically, and it was obviously, there was clear that there was going to be pretty major visual effects shots.
He really just said, let's go into it thinking, here's the world I want to show, and here's the things that we couldn't do on the first one.
Many of the digital elements in the film had their practical counterparts, such as the various sci-fi sets and vehicles which would be digitally enhanced, to the engineer himself having a stand-in actor who wore a suit that would have been good enough on its own in a final scene that informed the digital character.
Team again, built a full prosthetic version of the Deacon for the birth of it from the engineer. And what you see in the film is something, again, where we shot everything practically as much as we could.
But it was just a couple things that we had to add to it. Weta essentially took a digital scan of the creature on set, the puppet, photographed it, and they built a version that matched to it exactly.
With a lot of match moving, enhancements, and touch-ups in post-production, Scott's statement of digital not necessarily being cheaper than practical becomes more apparent. Reference is everything, and without it, the digital enhancements just wouldn't look right. And creating entirely digital scenes out of thin air is an even more difficult task. Though perhaps one of the most memorable creature moments in Prometheus is when the film's protagonist removes an alien from inside herself using a medical bay on the ship. This section of the film was done with a lot of practical elements. First, to simulate the alien inside of Shaw, as they would have the actress contort her stomach to make it look as if something was inside.
First, I was actually on the table and I was using my own stomach to kind of move it in a very weird, just blowing it up and kind of using the, my muscles in my belly to kind of move it in a weird way. And first, they kind of planned to do that with my dummy, but when Ridley wanted me to try things, he was like, "Oh, that's really disgusting. You're quite good at this, let's do this."
Beyond contorting body movements, they put a lot of effort into making all of it look as real as possible.
There is the point in which we need to cut into Numi's body. We need to actually perform the cesarean. So we life cast Numi in the position that she will be in at the moment. Right. So that's the neutral position. And from that create a silicon dummy, which is painted and textured to look exactly like her.
Above her, they had mechanical arms that were able to articulate through levers to grab the embryonic sac.
The first thing we had to do is to get the creature inside. And to get the creature inside, we had to roll it up in a certain way so that we could guarantee that on every shot he would look the same. That was then introduced into the condom, and then into the condom we then added the fluid. The tighter it was, the more violently the release, and more beautiful it was. You could the condom becomes completely clear with liquid.
When the condom burst, they designed the alien to flop around and give us that beautiful, visceral scene.
It's a series of discs, and each stage has a number of cables, normally 4, that give it left, right, up and down motions. And by stacking them together, you can get what's called an S shape or a complete curl. Thought 60 or 70 cables running to the tentacles through the body of the creature.
In the end, Prometheus was viewed as a somewhat flawed film. But with the making of a star in Michael Fassbender's interpretation of the android David, interestingly enough though, Roger Ebert would give the film a 4 out of 4 and said it was a seamless blend of a story, special effects, and pitch-perfect casting filmed in a sane, effective 3D that doesn't distract, and that the protagonist's character continues the tradition of awesome feminine strength begun by Sigourney Weaver in Alien. But at the end of the day, this film was pretty dividing for most Alien fans. But Ridley Scott would push forward towards the next episode in the Alien franchise, with Ridley Scott saying that many of the unanswered questions in Prometheus could be answered with a sequel. And you can watch the production of that sequel, Alien Covenant, right here.